Sarah sat by the window, watching the autumn leaves swirl in the wind. The golden hues painted the world outside, yet inside, her heart was frozen in time. She had spent the last 3 years rebuilding her life after James, her husband, disappeared without a trace. The silence he left behind was deafening, but she had learned to live with it. Until today. A thick, cream-colored envelope rested on her kitchen table. It bore no return address, yet something about the way her name was written in bold, familiar strokes sent a chill down her spine. With trembling fingers, she tore open the seal, her heart pounding. Sarah, I never meant to hurt you, but there's something you need to know. I'm married again. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She read them again, hoping she had misunderstood. But no, the truth was there, stark and unrelenting. James was alive, and he had moved on. For years, she had clung to hope, believing that he would come back. That maybe, just maybe, he had been in an accident, lost his memory, or was trapped in some situation beyond his control. But now, that illusion shattered into 1,000 pieces. The letter continued. I owe you an explanation. Meet me at our old cafe tomorrow at noon. The old cafe. The place where they had shared endless conversations, whispered dreams, and made promises that now felt like a cruel joke. Sarah clenched the letter in her fists, torn between rage and the desperate need for answers. What kind of man walks away from his wife without a word, only to return years later with a confession like this? And why now? Taking a deep breath, she made her decision. Tomorrow, she would go to the cafe. Not for closure. She wasn't sure that was possible. But she would go for the truth, even if it shattered her all over again. Sarah barely slept that night. Each time she closed her eyes, James' words from the letter echoed in her mind. I owe you an explanation. What explanation could justify disappearing for 3 years and marrying someone else? She tossed and turned, a storm of emotions raging inside her. Anger, confusion, grief. By morning, she had made up her mind. She needed answers, even if they left her more broken than before. At exactly noon, she walked into Riverside Cafe, their old spot. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries filled the air, just as it had all those years ago. The place hadn't changed, but Sarah had. She wasn't the same woman who used to sit by the window, waiting for James to arrive. Then she saw him. James sat at their usual table, looking almost the same, except for the faint lines around his eyes and a heavier weight in his expression. His dark hair, once neatly styled, was slightly disheveled. He looked up, and the moment their eyes met, time seemed to freeze. Sarah forced herself to stay calm as she walked over. She pulled out a chair, sat down, and folded her arms across her chest. You have 5 minutes, she said coolly. James sighed, rubbing his hands together. I deserve that. She waited, saying nothing. Let him squirm. Sarah, I never meant to disappear like that. His voice was softer than she remembered, almost hesitant. I had to leave. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. Had to? James, you vanished. No message, no clue, nothing. Do you have any idea what that did to me? He looked down at his hands. I know. And I'm sorry. Sorry? Her voice shook with fury. That's all you have to say? James exhaled, glancing around as if searching for the right words. Finally, he met her gaze. Sarah, I was in danger. And if I had stayed, so were you. She frowned, caught off guard. What are you talking about? James leaned in slightly. The night before I left, something happened. Something that put my life, and yours, at risk. Sarah's heartbeat quickened. Risk? From who? James hesitated, then shook his head. I can't tell you everything. Not yet. But I swear I never stopped thinking about you. Sarah clenched her fists. You never stopped thinking about me? You married someone else, James. Guilt flickered in his eyes. It's complicated. No, she stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. It's simple. You left me, and now you're married. So, why are you here now? James swallowed hard. Because I think I made a mistake. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She stared at him, unable to believe the words that had just left his mouth. A mistake? She wanted to scream, to demand why he had written that letter, why he had dragged her back into his mess. But before she could speak, the cafe door swung open, and a woman walked in. A woman Sarah recognized from pictures on social media. James' new wife. And she was walking straight toward them. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched the woman approach. She had seen her before. A few months ago, one of her friends had sent her a link to an anniversary post on social media. The smiling couple in the picture? James and her. Now, standing right before her, was the same woman from that post. Tall, poised, and undeniably beautiful. She had dark brown hair cascading over her shoulders, a sharp, confident gaze, and an air of elegance that made Sarah feel as if she were a forgotten page in James' past. Sarah looked at James. His face had gone pale. James? The woman's voice was firm, controlled. What is this? Silence. Sarah folded her arms, her heart pounding against her ribs. If James thought he could walk back into her life and make excuses, he was about to learn otherwise. James hesitated before finally turning to Sarah. Sarah, this is Emily. Sarah let out a dry chuckle. Oh, I know exactly who she is. The woman you married after you walked away from me. Emily's sharp eyes darted between them. What does she mean, James? James opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Sarah stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You know what, James? I don't need this. She grabbed her bag. I don't know what you expected to accomplish here, but I'm done. She turned on her heels and walked toward the door, anger burning in her veins. Sarah, wait. James called after her. She stopped. Not because she wanted to hear more lies. Not because she still cared. But because after everything he had done, he did not get to call the shots anymore. She turned slowly. Why, James? Why should I wait? To hear you stutter through another excuse? To hear you say you made a mistake while your wife stands right here? Emily's gaze darkened. Excuse me? James ran a hand down his face. Emily, I was going to tell you. Tell me what, James? Emily's voice turned ice cold. That you were meeting your ex-wife behind my back. Sarah's stomach twisted at the word. Ex-wife. For years, she had waited for closure. But now, standing here in front of James and the woman he had chosen, it hit her. She had never truly needed it. He was the one who left. He was the one who moved on. And yet, he was the one asking to meet? To talk. To explain? Sarah took a slow breath, forcing herself to remain calm. James, she said, her voice steady, whatever mistakes you think you made, it's not my problem anymore. And with that, she turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving James and his wife behind. But just as she stepped outside, her phone buzzed. A new message. From an unknown number. You don't know me, but you need to hear the truth about James. Meet me tonight. 8 p.m. The old bookstore. Sarah stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Who is this? And what truth did they have to tell? Sarah stood outside the cafe, the cold autumn air biting at her skin. Her heart pounded as she reread the message on her phone. You don't know me, but you need to hear the truth about James. Meet me tonight. 8 p.m. The old bookstore. Her fingers trembled slightly as she gripped the phone. Who could this be? And more importantly, what truth could they possibly tell her that she didn't already know? For 3 years, she had lived in the shadow of James' disappearance, mourning a man who had never truly been lost, just gone by choice. He had built a new life, a new marriage, and yet, today, he had sat across from her, claiming he had made a mistake. What mistake? And why now? Sarah knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to ignore this message. By 7:50 p.m., she was standing outside the Book Nook, a quiet little bookstore on the corner of an old street. The place had been her refuge once, a cozy escape where she would lose herself in novels while waiting for James after work. Now it felt like a meeting point for ghosts of the past. The door creaked as she stepped inside. The store was dimly lit, the scent of aged paper and ink filling the air. A few customers browsed the shelves, but none of them seemed to be looking for her. Then, from the far end of the store, a man stood up from a small reading nook. He was tall, with graying hair and a serious expression. His sharp brown eyes locked onto hers, and he gave a slight nod. "Sarah," he asked, his voice low. She hesitated. "Who are you?" The man glanced around, then gestured to the empty table in the corner. "Please sit." Sarah hesitated for only a moment before pulling out a chair. "Start talking." The man exhaled. "My name is David Carter. I used to work with James." Her stomach twisted. "Work with him?" "As in, before he left." David nodded. "Before he disappeared. Before he got married again." His voice darkened. "Before he got involved with the wrong people." Sarah's breath caught. "What are you talking about?" David leaned in, lowering his voice. "Did James ever tell you why he left?"
She scoffed. "No."
"He just sat across from me today, acting like he had some big secret, but couldn't say it yet." David's jaw clenched. "That sounds like him. Always keeping the worst parts hidden." He looked her straight in the eye. "Sarah, James didn't just walk away from you. He ran. And he wasn't running alone." Sarah's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "What does that mean?" David hesitated, then pulled out his phone. After a few taps, he turned the screen toward her. A grainy photo filled the screen. James, standing in a dimly lit alleyway, talking to a man Sarah didn't recognize. The second man wore a black coat, his face partially obscured, but something about the image sent a chill through her. "Who is that?" she asked. David's voice was grim. "Someone James should never have done business with." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Business?"
James was an accountant, David.
"He worked in an office." "What kind of business are you talking about?" David sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "James wasn't just an accountant, Sarah. He was handling money for people who don't like loose ends. And when things went south, he disappeared." Sarah felt like the floor had been ripped out from under her. "Are you saying James was involved in something illegal?" David nodded slowly.
"Yes."
"And if he's back in town, that means one of two things. Either he thinks he's safe or someone has found him." A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. "And if it's the second one?" she asked quietly. David's expression was grave. "Then you might be in danger too?" Sarah's heart pounded, so hard it hurt. She had spent 3 years trying to heal, to move forward, and now James had crashed back into her life, bringing a storm with him. David placed a card on the table. "If James contacts you again, call me. And whatever you do, don't trust him." Sarah stared at the card, then back at David. "Why are you telling me this?" David stood up, his expression unreadable. "Because you deserve the truth. And because I owe James one last chance to make things right." With that, he turned and walked out of the bookstore, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of his words. "Don't trust James." She looked down at her phone, still open to his message from earlier. "I think I made a mistake." Sarah exhaled shakily. "So did I, James." But this time, she wouldn't let herself be fooled. Sarah barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, David's warning echoed in her mind. "James didn't just walk away from you. He ran. And if he's back in town, you might be in danger too." She had spent years believing James had abandoned her for another woman. That betrayal alone had been painful enough, but now she was being told it was something far worse. By morning, her mind was made up. She needed answers. Sarah spent the day debating whether to call James or confront him in person. Every logical part of her told her to walk away, to leave the past buried. But there was another part of her, the part that had spent 3 years wondering why, that refused to let go just yet. By late afternoon, she found herself standing outside the address James had messaged her, an upscale apartment building on the other side of town. She hesitated before pressing the buzzer for his unit. A long pause. Then a crackle of static. "Sarah?" His voice was cautious, surprised. "We need to talk," she said firmly. A few seconds passed before the door unlocked. Sarah took a steadying breath and stepped inside. James' apartment was sleek and modern, a stark contrast to the cozy home they had once shared. Expensive furniture, minimalist decor, It felt like someone else's life entirely. James stood by the window, looking uneasy. You came? Sarah crossed her arms. I need the truth, James. And this time, I won't let you lie to me. He turned to face her, and for the first time, she noticed how tired he looked, like a man carrying the weight of something far too heavy. Sarah, I never wanted you to get involved in this.
She scoffed.
Too late. James exhaled. What did David tell you? Sarah's heart pounded. So he wasn't even going to deny it. That you weren't just some accountant. That you were handling money for dangerous people. That you ran because something went wrong. James clenched his jaw. He's right, isn't he? She pressed. Silence. Finally, James nodded.
Yes.
But it's more complicated than that. Sarah stared at him, waiting. He ran a hand through his hair before speaking. I was working for a client, a powerful one. At first, it was just financial consulting. Then little by little, I started noticing things. Accounts that didn't add up. Transfers that looked wrong. Sarah's stomach tightened. What kind of transfers? James hesitated. Money laundering. They were using my firm to move dirty money. Sarah felt a chill creep up her spine. So you just left? You didn't report them? James let out a bitter laugh. Sarah, you don't report people like that. They make sure you disappear before you get the chance. She swallowed hard. So you disappeared instead. James nodded. I faked a transfer overseas. Took on a new identity. Married Emily to blend in. It was the only way to keep them off my trail. Sarah's head spun. All these years and he had been living a life of fear. But then, something didn't add up. If you went through all this trouble to hide, why did you come back? James' expression darkened. Because I thought it was over. He exhaled sharply. But then I started getting messages. Warnings. Someone knows I'm back. A sinking feeling settled in Sarah's gut. David said if you're back, that means they found you. James' grip tightened on the edge of the table. And if they found me, they might come after the people I left behind. The realization hit her like a truck. Her. Sarah took a step back. Are you saying I'm in danger because of you? James looked pained. I don't know. But I had to warn you, just in case. Sarah's mind raced. Just 24 hours ago, she had thought the worst thing James had done was leave her. Now, she was standing in his apartment, listening to him confess that his past might come back to haunt her. Sarah, he said, stepping closer, I never stopped caring about you. I thought I was protecting you by leaving, but if I was wrong.
Sarah put up a hand. Don't.
She had waited too long to hear those words.
Now they meant nothing.
I don't need your guilt, James. I need to know what happens next. James swallowed. I have a plan. But you have to trust me. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. Trust him? After everything? She wasn't sure she could. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed. Another unknown message. You don't have much time. Meet me tonight. 10 p.m. The river docks. Come alone. Sarah's blood ran cold. James saw the look on her face. What is it? She turned the phone toward him. His face paled. Sarah, this is bad. Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. She had walked into this conversation looking for answers. Now, she was caught in something far bigger than she had ever imagined. And there was no turning back. The wind howled through the deserted streets as Sarah tightened her coat around her shoulders. The night felt heavier than usual, laden with an invisible weight that pressed against her chest. She checked her phone again. 10:07 p.m. James had begged her not to come alone. If this is who I think it is, it could be a trap. But Sarah had already made her decision. If someone had gone to the trouble of tracking her down, she needed to know why. The docks loomed ahead, quiet and empty except for the gentle lapping of water against the wooden pillars. A single street light flickered above, casting eerie shadows along the pavement. Sarah hesitated before stepping forward. You're late. She spun around at the voice. A man emerged from the darkness, his face partially hidden beneath a hood. Sarah's heart pounded. Who are you? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded envelope.
Take it.
Read it when you're safe. Sarah didn't move. What is this? The man exhaled, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. A warning. And a choice. Sarah's fingers tightened into fists. A warning about what? The man hesitated before lowering his hood. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew that face. David. But not her David. This was an older version of him. Gaunt, haunted, his features sharp with exhaustion. Her mind reeled. You know. You can't be. The man sighed. I don't have time to explain everything. Just know this. You're caught in something dangerous, and if you don't leave now, it will destroy you. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. Why should I trust you? David's look softened, just for a moment. Because I already lost you once. I won't let it happen again. Sarah's blood turned to ice. What was he talking about? A sudden noise echoed from the distance. Car tires screeching against the pavement. David's face turned grave. They're here. He grabbed Sarah's wrist. Run. Sarah's breath hitched as David pulled her into the shadows between two cargo containers. The sound of tires screeching against the pavement sent a chill through her spine. Who was coming? Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she crouched behind the cold steel, gripping the envelope David had given her. The docks, once eerily silent, now buzzed with tension. Who are they? She whispered. David's gaze darted toward the black sedan, pulling up near the water's edge. A man stepped out, tall, well-dressed, and exuding quiet authority. He wasn't alone. Two others flanked him, scanning the area. David's grip on Sarah's arm tightened. They work for the people James ran from. Sarah swallowed hard. How do you know that? David hesitated. Because I used to work for them too. Sarah's world tilted. What? David looked at her with a strange mix of regret and urgency. It's complicated. But right now, the only thing that matters is getting you out of here. The men by the sedan began moving, their eyes sweeping the docks. Sarah took a shaky breath. James told me he disappeared to protect me. Is that true? David nodded.
Yes.
But leaving you didn't erase the debt he owed them. He took something when he ran, and they've been looking for him ever since. Sarah's stomach clenched. What did he take? David glanced at her hand, where the envelope trembled in her grip. The proof that could bring them down. Sarah's blood turned to ice. David exhaled. James thought he could hide forever. He was wrong. They found him. And now they know you exist. The weight of his words settled like a stone in her chest. So, what do I do? David's jaw tightened. You leave town. Tonight. Disappear the way James did. Sarah shook her head. I can't just run. You don't have a choice, David pressed. If you stay, they will use you to get to James. Sarah clenched the envelope. She had spent years wanting answers, chasing closure. Now she had it. But at what cost? The men were getting closer. David squeezed her hand one last time.
Go. Now.
Sarah hesitated, but only for a second. Then she ran. And for the second time in her life, she disappeared. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share.